Really excited to welcome you all. My name is Xander Willoughby. I work on Connexus at Search for Common Ground, part of the Asia Religious and Ethnic Freedom Consortium. Today is one of our quarterly Asia Ref webinars that are open to feature some of the work being done within this consortium, within the field of religious and ethnic freedom. Today's webinar is called Social Media, Hate Speech, and Freedom of Religion or Belief in Asia. We have three really great speakers. We have Ayan, Mike, and Gracia who are going to speak, each present their work a bit, get the conversation started, and then the last, I'd say 15 to 20 minutes, we'd like to hear from all of you in the audience, questions, things that this reminded you of, work that can be connected, things like that. So I'll leave it there to have time for presentation. So Ayan, I'll go ahead and hand you the floor to get us started.
Hello, everyone. First of all, thank you for Search for Common Ground for having me here and for having a chance to share my thoughts on hate speech and freedom of religion. Today, I'm going to talk about the hate speech in the context of Kazakhstan. A very brief info about Kazakhstan for those who might not be quite familiar. So Kazakhstan is the biggest Central Asian country, which gained its independence in 1991 since the collapse of the Soviet Union. So it's always important to keep in mind that Kazakhstan is a post-Soviet country. And when we talk about the current laws and the overall approach of the government to various issues, it's very important to keep in mind that. So I would like to highlight what I'm going to share with you. I will look at the current laws about the hate speech and freedom of religion. Then I'm going to discuss the concept of traditional versus non-traditional religions. I have to say that I'm not a journalist or human rights activist. My background is in religious studies, so my angle to these issues is rather from this point of view. In the third part, I'm going to briefly touch the hate speech produced by mass media here in Kazakhstan. And at the end, I will try to share my thoughts on how to improve the current context. So I should say that there are no such terms as hate speech or hate crime in all laws, but this is being regulated by Article 20 of the Constitution, which prohibits the propaganda of religious superiority, and by the fifth article that disallows public organizations that are aimed at inciting religious hatred. It also falls under the penal code, where the deliberate public actions, including mass media and online, aimed at the hurting religious feelings that are being punished by huge fine or imprisonment up to 7 years. Bearing that in mind, since there is no hate speech term in the laws, the above mentioned articles are very vague and it's unclear what exactly is prohibited. For example, what does a propaganda of religious superiority mean? It's no secret that every religion claims itself as the most accurate one and claim that others are as the wrong ones. It's very natural. Does this actually mean the superiority? The law doesn't answer that. Secondly, when coming to the law enforcement, as the court cases show, there is more inclination towards restricting form and the freedom of as some research shows, there are almost no acquittals, and moreover, police or other government agencies tend to abuse this vagueness and basing their decision on the formal criteria, not taking into account the context, the negative consequences of hate speech. So these all issues lead to the main problem. There is a clear disbalance between the form and the countering hate speech, both offline and online. According to the law, I believe that the most hate speech cases here in Kazakhstan has to do with the concept of a traditional versus non-traditional religions. So according to the law, Kazakhstan recognized so-called historical role of Hanafi Madhab. It's a school of thought in Islam and Christianity. So the traditional Islam is the Hanafi Islam. Based on the government, since its early independence, chose this traditional versus non-traditional narrative as a way of countering violent extremism. It actively supported only still one officially recognized Islamic organization, the Spiritual Administration of Muslims of Kazakhstan. And apart from that Hanafi school, all others are labeled as non-traditional Islam of Kazakhs. And so leaving aside the problems with this narrative from academic point of view, I can say that regardless of how good intentions of government were when pushing this problem, it caused us versus them dichotomy, ultimately fueling the increase in hate speech. I believe this context is one of the main causes of intolerance and hate speech happening now in online. So I categorize the main trends of hate speech happening in online into four big categories. So the first one being traditional Muslims versus Salafis, Shiites, or any other Islamic groups. Second one is the traditional Muslims versus Tengrism. It's a neo-pagan movement. And the third one is religious people versus atheists. And finally, I'm going to talk about how mass media portrays non-traditional Muslims. So first example is a commentary of one of the book users left under the news about the hijabs in public schools. So as you can see here, she's talking about the non-traditional Muslims. She says that claiming themselves super believers, all covered in a Islamic veil and in short pants, in essence, they are spiritually damaged people. So this shows this very small example shows the overall context of what is happening both in Facebook, in Twitter, in the Kazakhstan context. So the second one is about Tengrism. The followers of this neo-pagan movement consider themselves as a true Kazakhs and believe that Kazakhs should return to their roots, what was before Islam. Nowadays, there is a huge debate between these two groups where some of the Muslims call to even ban this movement, since they believe it incites the religious hatred toward Muslims. This is the example of someone talking about Tengrism. Tengrism is a religion of alcoholics. That's why to talk about it means not respecting yourself. So as we can see, two main trends connected to this problem of traditional versus non-traditional movements. And the third thing that it's a hate speech towards atheists. So according to the recent researches in Kazakhstan, around 58% of people believe that the religious people have higher moral qualities than the people who do not believe in God, and around 60 people claim that it is not acceptable when those who do not believe in God express their view publicly. These trends, of course, lead to hate speech online mainly from Islamic groups, because 70% of Kazakhstani population are Muslims. So what is interesting is that how mass media also negatively contribute to these types of hate speech. For instance, in one of the most viewed news portals, they published the article titled "They Are Like Zombies," ahead of this Islamic representative office about the followers of the non-traditional Islam. I focus your attention what is written under the title. Deputy Mufti told how hard it is for them to change the mind of those who have fallen under the influence of extremist preachers. This news portal equates the non-traditional Islam to extremism by linking them to each other. So it's basically telling us that all leaders of non-traditional Islam, being a non-Hanafi Islam, should be viewed as extremist preachers. Or take another example. This was published in Instagram. The article is about how destructive religious organizations scam people. It might be in some sense okay, but at the end of the text, it says the list of well-known but still existing religious groups in Kazakhstan includes Pentecostal, Seventh-day Adventists, Baha'i, Mormons. To this list, the extremist organizations such as Grace, Agape, and the Living Wine can be added. I should tell you that all above mentioned religious group like Pentecostals or Baha'i are officially registered and recognized by the government, but still this article puts in the same line these communities into the list of extremist organizations. This very short glances at the hate speech produced by the media tells the very low understanding of how hate speech might hurt the religious communities and their everyday life. Thinking how the situation can be changed, I think there are two ways, not mutually exclusive. So the first measure, I call it soft measures. So it might be conducting the reports on hate speech, on the cases of hate speech in Kazakhstan. It's also conducting trainings for government officials and for journalists on avoiding hate speech. It also might be including critical thinking and tolerant classes into school programs to eliminate these trends in the future. And hard measures might include softening the laws. As I told you, there is no hate speech definition in the laws. It all falls under the penal code. So hard measures might include the softening the laws that restrict form and freedom of expression and adaptation of the anti-discrimination law. It's also one way. And of course, it's stop using or change, or at least change the official narrative pushed by the government, this traditional versus non. It also might be helpful to incorporate a ranking of hate speech types based on its consequences and the overall context, not putting all the hate speech cases into one single list. And so these are two ways of dealing with this issue in Kazakhstan. So to conclude my presentation, I would like to say that the problem of hate speech is not discussed enough in the Kazakhstani context, and the government needs to find the right balance between the hate speech and freedom of expression and the form. And I think that the Kazakhstan should understand that this concept of traditional bring more negative consequences than the positive ones to the communities, to the overall situation. I'm rather quick, and it was a very brief, introduction to this complex issue. Yeah, I think that's it, and thank you for joining. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to do my best to answer them.
Thank you, Ayan. This was a really helpful overview of such a complex topic. To be able to touch on this, I think especially the lines where we draw us and them dichotomies, and especially looking at where in society holds responsibility for grappling with hate speech. Really appreciate it. Well, I didn't think of this when doing the run of show, but geographically, we're going from Kazakhstan south to Sri Lanka now. To Mike, I'll go ahead and hand it over to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Xander. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you, and a special thanks to Xander and the team for the invitation. So in the next few minutes, I want to briefly talk a little bit about the context in Sri Lanka as it relates to harmful speech, touch a bit on the current situation in the country, and then go into some trends that we've been monitoring, and end with some observations regarding responses to the problem of harmful speech. So, like I said, the context, a little bit about the context, I think to comprehend the phenomenon of harmful speech in Sri Lanka, we must first consider the broader social political realities that have shaped our nation. As many of you may be aware, Sri Lanka endured a brutal civil war that lasted 3 decades, which was primarily rooted in ethnic tensions between the majority Sinhalese and the minority Tamils. However, with the end of the war in 2009, of course, the end was achieved militarily and there was no political solution. We then saw a rise in Sinhala Buddhist nationalism, which led to increased hostilities towards the country's religious minorities, namely the Christians, the Muslims, and of course the Hindus. And as you all may know, again, Sri Lanka is predominantly Buddhist, and historically, unfortunately, state policy and practice has been majoritarian in nature. But in the recent past, the complexity surrounding ethno-religious tensions have only increased. And why I say that is because we've seen in the recent past even a rise of extremism within minority religious communities, which have of course been fueled, manipulated, and used by state actors. So there's no hiding that Sri Lanka as a nation is polarized. We've been polarized, and sadly we continue to be polarized as well. And when you frame it that way, violent content on social media is nothing new, and what we see in the online space is actually a manifestation of much longer standing communal fears, anxieties, and concerns that have actually plagued our country. And today, as a nation, we are grappling with a severe economic crisis. Of course, things have improved compared to perhaps 2022 and 2023. And the economic crisis is the worst in our post-independence history. And at the same time, we are now dealing with a widening democratic deficit. Our civic space has rapidly diminished. Elections have been repeatedly postponed. There's a sharp decline in freedom of expression. And we've seen even the suppression of protests, attacks on journalists, to name a few. And of course, we have to add to this the continuing trend of religious freedom or FOB violations that we've seen. And to give you an idea, since 2021, the NCSL, the organization that I work for, we've documented over 190 instances of FOB violations against minority communities. And sadly, 50%, more than 50% of these violations, we find the state as the main perpetrator. And that's been something very troubling for us. Also, at the same time now, talking about the democratic situation in the country, we are seeing this new trend of legislative processes being rushed in the country, often without consultation from relevant stakeholders, and sometimes even in contradiction to judicial decisions regarding certain laws. And one example for this is the much talked about Online Safety Act, which has been heavily criticized by civil society in our country for its, in one sense, unprecedented undermining of free expression online. So in that context, I think we need to look at social media. And in Sri Lanka, social media, I think, has played a dual role of both serving as a vehicle for positive democratic impulses, but also at the same time for very dangerous ones. And that's been our story. And also at the same time, our demographics is interesting. Actually, 23% of our population is between 20 and 34 years old. And then another 7% is between 35 and 39. So if you take our population, 30% are below 39 years of age. And since the end of the war, we've also seen a digital bloom of sort, where there has been an explosive growth in the number of mobile devices used to access mainly the internet, but of course social media too. So in that context, harmful speech against religious minorities in Sri Lanka is nothing new. And in the past 10 years, that's from 2014, we've had at least 5 large-scale episodes of violence against the Muslims, which of course were followed by online content targeting, or harmful online content targeting the Muslim community. And in fact, as a response, we even had the government at that point restrict social media, access to social media, and other leading social media platforms as well, particularly after one such episode in 2000. So hate speech, manifesting in forms of violence has been nothing new in Sri Lanka. We've seen this over the past decade or so. And I'd like to talk a little bit about some trends that we've been noticing in 2013 in particular. Now, according to social media monitoring for harmful content, there were some very noticeable trends that we saw in 2023, like I mentioned. Firstly, harmful content against religious minorities is rampant on social media. For instance, I have a partner called #Generation who does excellent work in documenting online hate. And they've actually documented 499 instances of harmful content against religious minorities in 2023 alone. And 270 of these instances were against the Christian community, 193 were against the Muslim community, and 36 were against the Hindu community. And according to the data, individual users are the main perpetrators of online harmful speech, and with fake accounts coming at a very close second. Also, unfortunately, and I think this is true across the region as well, women are the main targets of harmful content online. And the other main target groups, apart from women, of course, have been religious minorities, sexual and gender minorities, and activists in particular. And especially harmful content targeting women from religious minorities, especially Muslim women of faith, have been a real cause for concern. And if you're interested, geographically, most harmful content originated from the western, central, and northern provinces of Sri Lanka. And just to give you a little bit of context, the western province is the most populous province in the country. It's home to the commercial capital, Colombo. Then we have the central province, which has a sizable Tamil minority. And of course, we have the north, which is predominantly Tamil and probably the province that is most affected in the 3-decade-long civil war. Also, another trend that we've noticed, and this is regarding response rates from platforms. According to the data, response rates from social media platforms, of course, varied. And one thing that we noticed is that Facebook removed 43% of the content that was reported. And of course, TikTok is the platform that fared well, mostly compared to the others. And TikTok actually removed 90% of the reported content. And particularly YouTube, of course, has been lagging when you compare with Facebook and Twitter with regard to taking down harmful content. I also want to speak a little bit about the nature of harmful content online. And in Sri Lanka, we see that false assertions and misinformation widely used to perpetuate harmful content. And this includes falsely associating political figures, public figures with minority faiths, and then also spreading misleading information about individuals' religious affiliations. And then this becomes a vehicle, a platform to kind of proliferate hate. And here, particularly false narratives are created to even paint communities as extremists, as terrorists, which have also contributed to a climate of fear in the country. Of course, one thing to note is that with the October 7th attacks in Israel, we also saw a spike in harmful content targeting the Muslim community in the country, and that was something concerning too. From that, when you look at the documentation, content is often triggered by political and social events such as protests, remembrance days, and even controversial statements made by certain public figures. For example, Catholic priests in Sri Lanka have long been associated with war-related memorialization events, and often they are when they partake in these events, they are targeted in online campaigns of hate. And also last year we had another incident where the Catholic Church boycotted the Independence Day celebrations because they were against the celebration at a time when the country was going through a very serious economic crisis. And this then resulted in widespread hostility on social media against the Catholic Church in general, but specifically against the Cardinal, who is seen in Sri Lanka as the figurehead of sort of the Catholic Church in the country. But apart from this, we've also seen misleading narratives, and that's been something commonplace in Sri Lanka, misleading narratives aimed at fostering disharmony between religious groups. For example, there have been posts falsely accusing Christians, falsely accusing Muslims of attempting to undermine the majority Sinhala Buddhist culture in the country, and that is a common narrative that we see when we look at online harmful content. And I want to briefly talk a little bit about responses to harmful speech. And now on civil society side, I think it's undeniable that a lot of work is being done, has been done to deal with the problem of harmful speech in the country. But also as somebody representing this group, even though much has been achieved, even though much has been done, particularly on the side of documentation on the side of literacy building with communities, one cannot help but think also that society's counter speech work is sometimes hostage to echo chambers and which are almost entirely distinct from the loci on social media that kind of proliferate hate and harmful content. And that's something that I think as a society we've had to grapple with, and we continue to grapple with as well. Also on the side of the state, and I'm not going to talk a lot about the laws in Sri Lanka because there's nothing much positive that we can talk about it, even though there are laws in place which can be used to deal with the problem of harmful speech online, or particularly speech that involves the problem has lied with the implementation of the law. Just to give you an example, we have a law called the ICCPR Act of 2007, and one of the main objectives of this act was to actually prosecute those who incite violence and advocate for religious and ethnic hatred. Now, 17 years since its passing in 2007, like I said earlier, we've had 5 large-scale episodes of anti-Muslim violence in the country. But in that 17 years, not one person, not one group that have openly incited hate, openly incited violence, preceding these events have ever been prosecuted. And that's something very unfortunate. And also, to make matters worse, rather than protecting the vulnerable, rather than protecting the minorities from harmful content, we've seen increasingly these laws being used to curtail free religious expression and in fact target minorities as well. Just to give you an idea, just to give you an example, just last year we had a Christian pastor who was arrested under this law for making some comments about other religions. And previously we've had authors, we've had social media commentators, we've even had comedians who have been arrested, and all because they've engaged in speech that were allegedly undermine the status of the main or the dominant religion in the country, or were perceived to be offensive to the majority community in the country. And perhaps just a concluding thought here as I wrap up. I think when you think of responses in a legislative sense in contexts like Sri Lanka, there is no doubt that harmful speech has been and continues to be a problem. But at the same time, our context is also plagued by enforcement of the law, often in bad faith. And that's been a real problem for us. So the question we grapple with in that context is, how do we work towards restoring the state's good faith before we even talk about legal regulations? And that's been very challenging. And so for this, and this also means that for us as civil society, that it has been very important for us to be careful, or sometimes even stop using terms like hate speech and even violent extremism very loosely and uncritically, because the laws that have been introduced to deal with these problems have been hijacked by the state and have been used by the state to not only target the very minorities that it should shield, but also it has systematically being used as a choice of weapon to kind of undermine the rights of minorities in the country. And I think I will stop with that.
Thank you, Mike. A really helpful context as well, and especially thinking of the difference between tackling these issues through like the legal system versus the words that we use, the narratives that we build into versus deconstruct. So it's really helpful. We'll continue our south from Kazakhstan to Sri Lanka, now to Indonesia. Gracia, I'll hand you the floor. Perfect timing.
Thanks, Xander. And thank you to you, Xander, and to the Connexus team for giving me this opportunity to talk about a project that the Search for Common Ground Indonesia team has been working on for the past year or so. So I would like to talk about, how we break the echo chamber and collaborate with youth creators in order to promote freedom of religion or belief. And while Ayan and Mike were talking more about, the hate speech context in each of the countries, since this project is coming to an end this year, I would like to discuss more about some of the learnings that we got, some of the challenges, and also some of the practices that we think really works in the context of trying to promote FORB, especially through social media. So a very brief background on freedom of religion or belief in Indonesia. Similarly, here we have also many issues, one of them being that a lot of the religious conversations on social media are mainly dominated by the more conservative narratives, and these can be very alienating for non-majority religious groups. And also, there's a significant underrepresentation of religious minority groups in Indonesia. what little coverage there is on mainstream media, on social media, usually focuses on information about, religious celebrations, surface level diversity, or maybe even victimization narratives when there are instances where there's persecution of religious minority groups. And then in the context of 2024, this was when the project initially began in 2022. We were preparing for the 2024 general elections, so the presidential elections, also the selection of the representatives. What happened was, in the past few years, we had a history of polarization and the use of identity politics to gain votes, to mobilize masses. And we anticipated at that time that this was something that could happen again. And this particular issue was, further more problematic because of a lot of mainstream media outlets also kind of going into religious issues. So certain media outlets had begun to cater to Islamic values, for example, trying to cater to the growing Islamic market here in Indonesia. And it sort of led to a kind of commodification of Islam in the media industry. And this was worsened due to some of the political groups in Indonesia being more hardline, but also being more involved in practical politics in Indonesia, and then endorsing certain presidential candidates. And this meant that these media outlets that also had, a stake in the politics, that were also supporting certain presidential candidates, would also go into the kind of narratives that discriminated against religious minorities. And so, this led to some of the most prominent news groups, TV, media, backing the narratives that were used, the hate speech, the more radical religious views that condemn religious minorities. So this is a very brief idea of what it was like at the time when we were designing this project. And the project was funded under the Asia Religious and Ethnic Freedom, or Asia REF Award, supported by USAID. The name of the project was Credible, so supporting youth and credible actresses to promote religious and ethnic freedom. It was initiated in January 2023 with the main goal of promoting religious freedom and pluralistic values in Indonesia. But it had two pillars of sorts, so two objectives under this goal that would contribute to the achievement of the goal, which is first strengthening the capacity of the key actors. In this case, the key actors were media actors and also content creators in Indonesia, and then creating opportunities under Objective 2 for collaboration to develop narratives that would promote FORB and a more tolerant understanding of religion here. So these are two activities that have the most intersection with social media. The first is under Objective 1, we had a media and FRB training for young content creators. We worked with local partners here with some very strong private sector partners from Indica Foundation and from Campaign. We also had partners from media organizations such as Sejuk to provide these trainings to become resource persons and to basically build a foundation on an understanding of the FORB issues in Indonesia, but also thinking about how content creators who might not be too familiar with the issue can kind of integrate FORB issues into their own content. And then the second pillar was having a mini grants initiative for the social media campaigns, for community events to be carried out by the creators and to kind of put all of that knowledge into practice. And so what we found really worked within this project was that our collaboration with the private sector, with Indica Foundation and with Campaign really provided us with great resources, great expertise. Indica Foundation, for example, provided a top up to the incentives that we provided the content creators to be able to join this program. And then some other strategic partnerships with alternative media. We had Jabar Bergerak, we had Suara.com. It was a mainstream media though, but they have interest in amplifying youth voices, and they were open to really assisting these content creators with their efforts even outside of the official mentoring process that Search for Common Ground and local partners had. And then we also had another thing that really worked, which is, I'm sure it can be quite, I think, a challenge within the nonprofit sector is having attractive incentives to draw the most interesting and creative individuals or creators here. And the reality is that at a certain level, the content creators that we work with, they will commodify their content because this is their livelihood. And so there is a need to provide some sort of incentive for them to be able to be interested to join the program and kind of contribute to the promotion of FORB in Indonesia. But on the other hand, there were also some non-monetary incentives here that were at play. So for example, some of the content creators that we worked with, they found that they had increased followers, increased reach and engagement when they stepped out of their comfort zone of, for example, talking about environmental issues and talking about education and kind of creating this intersectionality between these different issues, which was actually quite interesting for their audiences. Another thing that we found worked, especially for content creators that have sensitive issues. For example, in this photo here, we have a content creator who is focused a lot on LGBTQI+ issues and found that a lot of the content that they made usually had very, polarizing responses. But through the framing of sharing personal stories, sharing stories of this intersectionality between gender, sexuality, and religion, and focusing how even with these different gender identities, people still believe in religion or believe in God in their own way was very humanizing, and for the audiences was better received by them. Yeah, and so those were some of the things that works, but of course there are many challenges and lessons learned. And here I just want to focus on 4 main lessons learned that we had. Was first, of course, engaging the right creators. And so we, at the beginning of the project, had to, of course, choose, like, who would we be working with? Who are the content creators? Are they people who are established with more than 100,000 followers? Or are they, individuals, creators who are still emerging, who may not have that many followers, but have a really good engagement with their followers and actually want to have room to grow, want to have room to explore what kind of other content they can make? And also selecting between, having activists or non-activists. Some of the creators that we worked with, for example, the creator that was focused on LGBTQI+ issues was more of an activist, but then we had other people who were just, on lifestyle, on food, on travel, and didn't really have any background in, talking about social issues. And both of these creators had different challenges. Sometimes for the activists, it would be kind of different for them to think about a way to create something that's more popular, something that can reach out to audiences outside of the usual people who are interested in these issues. But then for the non-activists, it's also kind of figuring out a way to talk about FRB in a way that is sensitive, because they haven't built that sensitivity yet, and also find a way to merge between the issue that they have, the branding that they have, with the issue of FRB. On mentoring and quality assurance, one of the key lessons learned is, of course, having a very clear mentoring system. We were very fortunate to have strong local partners who we worked together with to create this mentoring system and have dedicated personnel to really work closely with the content creators and develop the ideas together. And sometimes creators might be stuck in this mind frame that they have to talk about FRB in a way that's really serious, when there are many other ways actually they can talk about it. Like, for example, some of the creators that in the beginning, while we were thinking about, how do we promote FRB in this way, they were thinking about, oh, we have to talk about this certain religious minority group, when they could also be talking about, for example, the culinary history of certain dishes in Indonesia that are related to certain religious groups within the country. And then there's also, of course, a risk of harm towards content creators. Similarly, I think to other countries, like Indonesia has some very problematic laws related to religion. We have the blasphemy law. There's also a hate speech law that's also used, though, in a way that's retaliatory towards other people and can be misused to, in fact, persecute religious minorities. So it's very important to identify the potential risks, but also have a very clear risk mitigation and risk management plan in action. And in this case, for the risk mitigation, of course, we had, the usual education, what the potential risks are, that you have to have a risk mitigation plan in place. but also the mentoring process that we had a very strong content screening panel. And so we really worked with the content creators to go through their ideas, to identify potential risks in language in the content that they were raising. And this was actually very helpful in kind of making sure that some of the more dangerous wording that could be used to persecute them were kind of stopped at that point. But then even more importantly is having a risk management plan, because even with the risk mitigation, there's always a chance that something might go wrong. And it did happen actually with one of our content creators who talked about a cartoon in Japan that had Jesus and Buddha as the main characters of this cartoon. And they were threatened by an anonymous person on social media that they would be reported on the basis of blasphemy. And so what we did at that time was we gathered together with this content creator and connected them with legal support, with a media team, with also interfaith actors. And we had interfaith actors who were willing to vouch for this content creator that they aren't going against the religious blasphemy law, because in order to be considered as religious blasphemy, you have to fulfill certain criteria. And they were willing to, step in and say that, no, this isn't religious blasphemy in our words, in our status as a religious organization. And so that was really helpful in kind of helping the content creator feel safe, but also understand, like, if something does end up happening, there's a way forward to manage this issue. And then finally, just briefly talking about, managing creator engagement. One of the things that we found here is that we wanted to engage them, on and on, just so that we didn't see a drop out of the content creators that we're engaging. But at the same time, sometimes for these content creators, it can be maybe a bit too much because they have their own schedules, they have other things that they want to do, and they might not always be able to join. But then there's also an issue of sustainability here, right? Because of course, the project itself won't run forever. And so having the right partners and stakeholders really helps with the sustainability. The local partners that we engaged, for example, Inika Foundation has their own independent programs that they run yearly and that they can use to take on the content creators after the project ends. And then also another local partner, Campaign, also has an application, the Campaign for Change app, and other activities where they can engage the content creators after the project. So these are some of the key learnings from the Credible project. And yeah, I think that's it. If there's any other questions, I'm happy to answer them in the Q&A session. Thank you.
Really interesting, Gracia. Thank you so much for sharing it. I'm especially struck by the different actors that were pulled into this project who probably wouldn't have worked together otherwise, from small-time creators to traditional media, but then also the diversity of content. I feel like a lot of times in these fields, we want to dive into these hard issues and then make content that's really boring to people who don't care about these issues as directly. So really interesting to see that. Thank you for sharing lessons learned. I'll invite each of our speakers up. We have time for a few questions. We'll put the questions together, give our speakers an opportunity to share some thoughts. And if we don't get to them, we'll figure something out on the back end to make sure that you're connected with the answers to the questions that you're looking for. So I'll start with Ashalu. This is to Ayan. Great presentation, Ayan. Just a quick one. I would love to hear from you about the media ecosystem of social media platforms in Kazakhstan and any response mechanisms to counter hate speech. This is a question from Ethiopia. Let's add one more question in because I think it's a similar one. Rizka, do you want to ask your question? Go ahead.
Yes, so thank you. I also would like to ask the question to Ayan. Actually, it's kind of similar with the previous question. So given the necessity of amending the law to address hate speech, could actually civil society organizations potentially collaborate with social media companies like Meta or TikTok to develop mechanism for flagging hate speech content as regulatory violations? Because I think this could lead to automatic removal of such content as an alternative method to prevent its circulation. Thank you.
Yeah, so first of all, regarding the first question, about the ecosystem and the countering mechanisms. So I believe that in Kazakhstan, everyone has a right to make complaints to police on the cases of hate speech, both offline and online, and then police decides whether to initiate the cases or not, or does it fall under the penal code or other codes. And in terms of the other mechanisms countering hate speech, so there are some there is a couple of indirect mechanisms. For example, our local Kazakhstani NGO, they conduct training sessions for especially for journalists on the media literacy, focusing on the religious field. So, and also law enforcement agencies, as I said, very broad power to ban and to suspend access to various websites or even entire network or even entire social networks if they want to. And these cases, there was some case in the past that when the law enforcement agencies abused this power, to sue the political forces in Kazakhstan. So yeah, there are the main, I would say, main ways of countering hate speech. But yeah, of course, we do have the laws that counter hate speech, but as I told you, it's very vague, and there are so many problems with this law. Yeah. And we don't have a separate anti-discriminative law. Yeah. If this answers your question.
Thank you, Ian. Really appreciate it. We'll hop to Johnny with a question for Mike. Question for Mike about the Online Safety Act in Sri Lanka. Your general thoughts on how this law is used for preventing violent extremism, hate speech, especially considering the history of misuse / lack of proper implementation of the laws previously.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Actually, the Online Safety Act, like I mentioned, has received a lot of slack, not just for the content of the law, but in the way the government has gone about passing it. Because like I mentioned earlier, there was a Supreme Court ruling, a judgment given for amendments to be made to the law, but the final shape of the bill, which was passed in Parliament, did not reflect the changes proposed by the Supreme Court. So it's not just the content in it, but it's also the way it was passed, which has set a very dangerous precedent of sort for democracy as a whole. But in terms of the content of the bill, it's extremely vague. There are a lot of opaque statements within the law, and Sri Lanka has a history, a legacy of such laws being misused. Even though the reason put forward by the government for the law was to kind of push back against cybercrime that was affecting women and children. When you look at the bill in itself, there's just nothing in it with regard to the stated purposes. And then there is broad power given to a commission, a 5-member commission appointed by the president himself to basically arbitrate on what could be truth, what could be prohibitive, what could be false statements, which again has no proper guidelines, no accountability. And it's just actually, I'm not sure whether there are other Sri Lankans here, but in my opinion, there's nothing to salvage of this bill. And in fact, it has to be repealed, and something new has to come about, because there's no room for reform, because the very essence of the bill, the very shape of the bill, the very structure of the bill is draconian, to say the least. I don't see anything positive coming out of it. And in fact, they're going to have a time implementing it in the country.
Thank you, Mike. That feels like a theme to an extent of how we deal with hate speech around the world, of finding specificity in laws and also vagueness and how to go about implementation. And then we'll wrap up with a question for Gracia about, with programs that work with content creators, especially youth from minority ethnic groups or religions, how do you go about sharing risk and safeguarding these content creators in projects like that? You mentioned connecting with legal support when needed, things like that, but curious about how others doing this work can touch on this.
So for this particular project, the risk mitigation information was always provided from the beginning of our engagement with the content creators. So for example, during our training, there were specific sessions that were dedicated to talking about risk management, case studies on actual cases where, you know, people, content creators were hit with blasphemy laws, hate speech on social media, and so on. So we did from the beginning kind of raise awareness that there is a risk about talking about religion, social media. But then going on to the next stage, you know, when they receive mini grants to implement campaigns and then also do community activities, that's where the kind of one-on-one, very specific mentoring and the risk mitigation, risk management comes into play there. And so it's really case by case. Like a lot of the content creators had content that was really safe, that we didn't see would have any risk. But then some of them were a little bit more willing to take on these risks. So for those ones, we would have specific conversations about, you know, do you understand the risks that are associated with this? Do you have mitigation or management measures in place? If not, then we need to talk about having these in place. And then also there are some times where we just say, you know, I don't think you should make this content. For example, in the case of somebody wanted to make a content about Israel and Palestine in Indonesia, and the situation just was not safe enough for them due to the immediate response that they would get from that. And so we just talked to the content creator and said, you know, we don't think this is a good idea. It's better to make another type of content. And so these are the conversations that we've had with them to make sure, yeah, that there's no harm done.
Really appreciate it. Thank you. We're at time. We have a few more questions and some comments and a lot of really great experience to share in the room. So we're looking forward to touching on this topic again in the future. We'll post the recording of this session on Connexus, and there's a comment feature there, so feel free to share your reflections there as well. But a huge thank you to each of our speakers today, for everybody for bringing their expertise, their experience. If you'd like to be connected with one of the speakers for further collaboration, please email us and we can connect you. If not, just a big thank you again, and we look forward to seeing each of you again very soon. Thanks, everyone.